Okay, so the next piece of self-regulation strength that I want to talk about has to do with self-control, which goes beyond delay of gratification to a variety of other activities and circumstances. In short, self-control is what you or I, well, not I, because I'm a psychologist, but what you or normal people on the street would call willpower. Do you have the ability to say no? Can you restrain yourself from doing something you shouldn't do? Can you force yourself to do something you know you ought to do? So that's really what we're talking about. It's not a super highly technical definition. So researchers have been discussing and debating and fighting about the nature of self-control for a number of decades now. There are three different ways we can conceptualize self-control. First, it could be that self-control is a skill. So it's much like a muscle, and the more I work it out, the more I exercise it, the more I have. The more of the ability to control myself I will gain. The second possibility is that self-control is knowledge. So for instance, people over time will gain information about how to better control their behavior. The reason kids suck at it is they don't have much knowledge, period, right? If you ever talk to a kid, they're not super knowledgeable folks. Adolescents are a little bit more knowledgeable. Adults are even more knowledgeable because they've gained more feedback and more knowledge over their lifespans. The third possibility for self-control is that it could be a depletable resource. It could be the case that people have a limited pool of self-control. You have X amount, and maybe that amount is different from person to person, but you personally only have a certain amount. When it's gone, it's gone. You can't control yourself very effectively anymore, any more than you could continue driving a car after you've run out of gas. Now you can perhaps get a car with a bigger gas tank. Maybe you can practice driving more efficiently or something so that you can go further. But the idea of this depletable resource is that once you run out or once you run low, it takes some time to build back up or to fill back up your gas tank. So researchers have, in order to look at this nature of self-control, researchers have devised a number of really clever research paradigms. To test it, they'd say, okay, what would happen if I ask you to do a self-control task and then do it again or do some other self-control task a few minutes later? So if I'm going to exert self-control at time one, there are a lot of different ways this could happen, right? This could be resisting doing something you really want to do. This could be making yourself do something you don't want to do, right? So there are a lot of different possibilities. If it's the case that self-control is a skill, then it should be the case that there shouldn't really be an effect on self-control at time two a few minutes later. In other words, if I have a pretty decently strong muscle and I lift 50 pounds, and then 5 minutes later I lift 50 pounds, right? It shouldn't have much of a discernible impact on my ability to lift that weight. Similarly, I should be just about as good at resisting urges at time two as at time one. The second possibility, if self-control is based on knowledge, then after I've exerted self-control successfully once, that should give me really valuable feedback about how to be even more successful the second time around. I'd say, dude, I just figured out how to resist temptation. That was awesome. I'm going to do it again. Right? So you'd imagine if you ask kids, please don't eat this marshmallow, and they hold out for 5 minutes and you come back and you say, hey, great job, I'm going to give you 5 more minutes. The kids should be better at it the second time around if this knowledge theory is true. The third possibility, though, is if self-control is a depletable resource. If I exert my self-control at one point in time, then I should have less self-control left over at a subsequent time down the road. And so I should do worse at that second self-control task. It's as though, I've been driving my car down the road, I've used up most of my gas, and so I have very little left for the remaining leg of my journey. So I'm going to show you a video clip that was created that shows a research study by Roy Baumeister, who's a really big name in this research area, that shows some of his research paradigms. So as you watch the video, it's a couple minutes long, about 5.5 minutes or so. I want you to keep an eye out for the methodology, so be able to say step by step what was it that participants did. Think about what behaviors were affected. And then finally, what was the mechanism? What caused self-control success or failure, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, so you got to watch the video to find out. But which of those three mechanisms seems to be supported by Muraven and Baumeister's research?
Hi, how are you? Wow, you found lots of good stuff. Oh, yeah.
Self-control. Many of us have difficulty with it. We often buy too much. And some of us have self-control issues around food. We often eat too much, while others just yell too much.
What were you thinking? Why did you cut me off? What's wrong with you?
Social psychologist Roy Baumeister studies self-control.
I've been persuaded that most of the social and personal problems that people suffer from in the United States have some degree of self-control failure at their core.
In contrast, those with good self-control have advantages.
Our own data show people with high self-control, better grade point average in school, fewer problems, better family relationships, better anger control, less likely to have all sorts of mental and physical health problems. So it really is one of the most wonderful and important psychological traits. Self-control and intelligence are about the only two traits that have really been shown to predict success in life in a broad sphere of endeavors.
Here in the laboratory, some unique studies are helping us to learn how self-control works.
Hi, Carol. For this part of the experiment, we're studying reactions to different types of foods. So I'd like you to sit here and sample some of the radishes, but do not eat the cookies. And I'll be back in 5 minutes.
People are tempted to eat the chocolate. They have to resist that. So they use self-control to override their impulse to just gobble down those chocolate cookies. But that uses up some of their strength, some of their willpower, and like a muscle that gets tired.
But before observing how exerting self-control makes subjects tired, let's watch another participant who gets different instructions.
Hi, Brittany.
Hi.
In this part of the experiment, we're studying reactions to different types of foods. So I'd like you to eat freely from this plate, the radishes or cookies, and I'll be back in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Brittany is not asked to exert self-control, and she goes right for the cookies. This difference between Brittany's indulgence and Carol's successful resistance can then be measured immediately afterwards during a second self-control task. The second task involves tracing without taking the pen off the paper. It's a frustrating task, but Brittany keeps at it. But Carol, like other subjects who exert self-control, seems to have less energy and spends only half as much time tracing.
That's the key lesson from that study. Resisting the temptation to eat those cookies used up something important inside of them, and then that was no longer available to enable them to keep on working and keep on trying and persisting in the face of failure.
But just what is used up inside when we exert self-control?
The brain does run on fuel, and it makes it plausible to start thinking in energy terms again. I mean, the human body is an energy system. Life itself is a process of consuming energy.
So studies are also exploring self-control and energy.
So first, we'll be checking your blood glucose levels.
Blood glucose, or blood sugar, supplies energy to the brain.
Okay, so now I'd like you to draw a small drop of blood so that we can measure the amount of glucose in your blood.
It's a simple test, and glucose levels are measured within seconds. Note the level over 100. Immediately afterwards, subjects are sent to another room and seated at a computer screen.
So first, we'd like you to watch a short video clip. I'd like you to watch it as you would normally, as if you're watching television at home.
These subjects are not asked to exert self-control. They simply watch this video clip, which has no audio, while words flash on the screen. In contrast, these women are told to watch the woman in the video, but to avoid looking at the words. That's the self-control part.
Your mind starts to look at those words, and you got to pull it back. So it's a totally psychological process. There's nothing physically strenuous about it.
But ignoring the words takes its toll, which can be measured afterward with new blood tests.
Lo and behold, the blood sugar dropped for people who exerted self-control.
Then a new twist is added, lemonade. Some of the lemonade is mixed with sugar, and sugar is quick-acting and will replace the glucose burned up during self-control. Jessica gets lemonade with sugar, but Hallie gets lemonade made with a sugar substitute.
The sugar substitute does not put anything into your bloodstream, does not give you anything for your brain to burn. And so those people depleted from the first task are then still depleted.
Another round of blood tests showed Jessica's glucose level has recovered, while Hallie's hasn't. Then it's off to a second self-control task.
Okay, in this part of the experiment, we're looking at tolerance. I'd like you to stick your arm into this ice water, keep it in there as long as you possibly can, and I'll time you to see how long you persist. Okay, ready? Okay, go.
Jessica, with her normal glucose level, keeps her arm in the ice a full 9 seconds. Subjects who did not exert self-control during the video also kept an arm submerged for about 9 seconds. But now it's Hallie's turn. Hallie can't tolerate the cold and pulls her arm out almost immediately after just 4 seconds. Her still depleted glucose level doesn't allow for good self-control. These studies demonstrate that exerting self-control comes with a price in the short run, but Baumeister emphasizes that in our everyday lives, good self-control can be learned.
If you exert self-control on a regular basis, it will make you stronger and make you a better person, and you'll have more in the future. In the short run, just like with a muscle, in the short run it gets tired when you exercise it, but in the long run it does get stronger.
Okay, so that's the gist of the radishes cookie experiment. It's very well known. It's been replicated and tested a number of different times. So let me go back for a second and make sure that you feel like you understand the procedure and the methodology. So there's the initial task, which is either eat freely from the plate, and most people choose cookies, or only eat radishes. So people are forcing themselves to use self-control. So again, we're sort of randomly assigning our participants to one of those two conditions. Then they do a second task, whether it's ignoring the words on the computer screen or persisting on the line tracing task or keeping your arm in a bucket of ice water. Across all of these tasks, Baumeister and his colleagues have found in a whole bunch of different studies that people who were allowed to eat cookies in the first place, who didn't have to do self-control in the first go-round, had more success with their self-control on the second task. On the other hand, people who had to exert self-control the first time around had a lot harder time exerting self-control the second go-round. So let's go back to those three possibilities. Right, we said which of these three theories or ideas about self-control is most strongly supported by the research evidence? Well, if self-control were a skill, you shouldn't see an effect on self-control at time 2, right? Because you already know how to do this. It shouldn't deplete at any sort of quick rate. That isn't what they found. So we're going to cross that possibility out. The second possibility was that people would do better on their self-control tasks at their second task because they've already practiced and they're better at it. They know what they're doing more successfully. That was also not what Baumeister and colleagues found. So instead, they conclude that self-control is a depletable resource because their participants did worse after exerting self-control on an initial task. That supports the idea that self-control is a depletable resource. So Baumeister published this and he and his colleagues did a whole bunch of research studies that all kind of pointed along this same way. But, I don't know if you knew there was a but, there's a big but. There's just one problem. There are now starting to be research studies questioning what exactly is the underlying mechanism, right? Is it actually the glucose thing? Is there something else going on? So what can we actually conclude about the relationship between self-control tasks at time 1 and performance on a subsequent self-control task at time 2? So I want to show you a portion of a little video that presents some counter research that sort of runs against what Baumeister and his colleagues say.
Real. But recently, some studies have started to cast doubt on this whole ego depletion thing. One group of researchers, for example, found that subjects didn't actually have to drink lemonade to replenish their willpower. Just tasting it, without the corresponding changes in blood glucose, could be enough. Others found that what subjects believed about willpower could affect their performance on self-control tasks. Participants who believed ego depletion was real gave up on difficult tasks way before those who didn't. And people who thought of willpower as an infinite resource did just as well on the second difficult task as people who hadn't done the first task at all. Then in 2014, some scientists tried to replicate the original studies, and couldn't find the effect. The group decided to look more closely at that 2010 meta-analysis, and they found a whole bunch of problems. For one thing, when they reanalyzed the data using newer methods, the ego depletion effect disappeared. For another, the data included in the analysis in the first place was probably biased in favor of ego depletion. See, scientific publications tend to publish positive results, the kind that prove the researcher's hypothesis. In other words, researchers might have done lots of studies that didn't find evidence of ego depletion, but odds are those results wouldn't have gotten published. The meta-analysis only looked at the data from published studies. There might have been plenty of studies that didn't find the ego depletion effect, but the analysis just wasn't taking those into account. When the team went back and included other unpublished data in the analysis, they found that, again, the ego depletion effect just wasn't there. These results were popping up right as a wave of concern about replicability was spreading through the psychology community. More and more researchers were saying they couldn't reproduce the results of various psychological studies. This wasn't just ego depletion, this was all of psychology, and people were starting to doubt whether they could really trust the published literature. All of this uncertainty led the Association for Psychological Science to open a registered replication report on ego depletion. Basically, one official experiment, based on a study originally published in 2014, would be conducted by researchers in many different labs. Each group of scientists would analyze their results and compare them to the results of other research groups. Baumeister, the head of the original study, was brought in to help design the experiments, and the psychologist who led the 2010 meta-analysis, Martin Hager, agreed to lead the project. Subjects were told to watch words flash on a screen and to press a button whenever they saw a word containing the letter E, but not if the letter E was within 2 spaces of another vowel. If that sounds like the most tedious, annoying thing ever, that was the point. The subjects had to pay close attention, and just like the original study, they then had to perform a follow-up self-control task. But when Hager's team did the same experiment in 24 different labs in different countries and languages, the ego depletion effect evaporated. Only 2 of the 24 groups found the effect at all, and even one group found the opposite effect. So what does this all mean for ego depletion? It depends. You could argue that it's just this particular task with the words flashing on the screen where ego depletion doesn't show up, but that willpower is still a limited resource. The thing is, the main reason why the ego depletion effect was such a big deal was that it held true across so many different tests, from cookies and radishes to conversations about race and discrimination to making decisions about what cleaning product to buy. But now, it seems like ego depletion only happens under very specific circumstances, if at all. Baumeister has said that he plans to launch his own replication studies in the hopes of proving that the effect is real. And other scientists who participated in the registered replication report have said that this single failed replication isn't enough. More research needs to be done with different experimental methods before psychologists can come to any real conclusions.
Okay. So he talks fast, and I will point out that if you need a little bit of a chance to go back and rewatch that, feel free to go back and rewatch that. But the basic gist, right, is thinking about the limitations of Baumeister's research on the ego depletion effect, right? Is it because of people drinking glucose, drinking sugar to replenish their blood glucose, or maybe it's something else? And what about beliefs about willpower? And what about these meta-analyses? And what about these replications that fail? So right now, as of 2018, Baumeister is planning his own replication study. He was not particularly happy about the consequences of the registered replication report that was described in the video that we just watched. Other researchers say cognitive fatigue is real, right? The idea that I engage in task A and then I have less mental resources to engage successfully in task B, but maybe it's not due to ego depletion, right? Maybe it's due to something else. Other researchers, they're kind of all over the place. That's science, right? That's the idea of continuing ongoing research exploration. And it might be that we don't have a clear yes or no answer for quite a long period of time. But I thought it was really important to talk about this idea of ego depletion and self-control in video lecture, because the book has a very strong, yes, pro-ego depletion interpretation, and doesn't give as much credence to these questions and limitations about it. So I'm trying to give you a little bit more balanced perspective on both of these 2 interpretations.